All right. I know I said good morning, but I guess we're actually afternoon. So used to these being in the morning. Okay, so good afternoon. Thank you all for hopping on with us. I'm sure we'll have more hop on as we go. Um, so this is part two in the two-part webinar that we had focusing on the Materials Management Task Force as part of the Climate Council. And we're kind of just diving into the topics that they discussed in order to make the recommendations that they did. So today we're going to go ahead and start off with Sydney Harris from Upstream to kind of talk about the circular economy and how that was as part of the task force recommendations. So take it away, Sydney.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me get my, oh, you know what? I don't have permission to share my slides somehow. Let me try again. I think it's just that you were sharing. Apologies. Let me get these pulled up. Okay, is that working now? Okay, super. So yeah, hello everyone. Thanks for having me today. I'm Sydney Harris. I'm the policy director at Upstream. If you don't know Upstream, we are a national nonprofit organization. We're small but mighty. We have about 10 full-time staff, but we work all over the US and Canada, and we like to refer to ourselves as a leading change agency for the reuse movement in North America. So we really work toward a robust and enduring reuse economy, which I will define. And yeah, basically we work on reuse all day, every day is the key takeaway there. So I mentioned the term reuse economy. We think of, you mentioned circular economy, but we think of the heart of a circular economy as a reuse economy. That means designing products from the start for quality, durability, longevity, material health, and recyclability, and getting them into a system where they can be used over and over and over again without changing form. So before we get to things like recycling and composting. Reuse is a primary climate solution, and since we're here talking about the Climate Council and our climate plan, I am going to talk a little bit more in depth about why that is. Ellen MacArthur Foundation estimates that in a city with scaled and shared reuse infrastructure, you can see up to about 70% greenhouse gas emissions reductions. Also, one of my favorite, I think, really powerful statistics comes from the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, kind of like their version of Maine DEP. And they estimate that to live within our planetary climate boundaries, we need a 90% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from the packaging sector specifically. And if we implemented recycling for packaging flawlessly everywhere in the country, we could get about 30% emissions reductions from the packaging sector. So recycling is only going to take us a third of the way that we need to go for packaging, and we need other solutions. Also, about half of the UN climate goals can be achieved with renewable energy, but only half. So basically the other half needs to come from changes to the way we make, package, use, and dispose of products. This is where about half of our global emissions are coming from. And you can see here that reusable packaging offers the kind of dramatic reductions in greenhouse gases that we are going to need. It's not just about climate, though. That's the great thing about reuse. It's also an industry, and it puts people to work, and it puts them to work locally in clean, safe jobs. There's about an 85% reduction in the toxicity score, the industry toxicity score for jobs in reuse, things like logistics, driving, dishwashing, all of that, compared to waste management jobs, which are things like, recycling and landfilling and all of the above. So before I go any farther, I do want to just quickly define what we even mean when we're talking about reuse. I defined a reuse economy. Upstream also has specific definitions for reusable packaging. We split it up into two categories. That's the most important thing. Returnable packaging is basically it's packaging that returns into the system, and so it is professionally cleaned by producers or third-party reuse providers. So as the consumer, you treat it very much the same way that you're accustomed to treating single-use packaging. And on the other hand, refillable packaging that's the kind of thing that we might be a little bit more familiar with in the reuse space. It's things like refilling a durable container at home or at the bulk aisle or something like that. And both are models of reuse, but they are distinct. There are a lot of different policy levers to catalyze different elements of a circular economy. So I'm kind of going to run through them a little bit quickly today, and then I'll land on what opportunities from this list we've already got going for us in Maine and where we have opportunity to do more. So I like to think of 3 different buckets when I think of policy for a circular economy and for reuse. The first bucket is about reduction. So source reduction or waste reduction policies often are things like bans or fees on single-use products or on waste. So one common policy that we support here is called skip the stuff or accessories on request. And that is pretty self-explanatory. It's basically like requiring businesses, usually food service businesses, to only provide disposable single-use utensils or condiment packets or things like that that end up being waste if the customer requests them. It actually saves businesses a lot of money because they don't have to constantly give these things out for free and buy them on the back end. And it saves us all the drawer of shame in our kitchen where these things accumulate when we don't actually want them. So skip the stuff has become popular. There are 2 states that have already passed this at the state level and many, many, many municipalities. There are also policies like cup and container charges and fees or bag bans or all kinds of things like that that would fall under this category of reduction. And then there are policy levers to catalyze refill. Things like BYO, enabling BYO in health codes, requiring water refill stations is something, for example, that Washington State did a couple years back now in all new construction. So these types of policies catalyze more of that consumer-driven refill behavior. And then there are policies that catalyze reuse systems or a reuse economy. And these are kind of the slightly more challenging policies sometimes to pass, but also with bigger bang for the buck. So this would be things like requiring everybody that serves food or beverages on site to do that in reusables. We call that reuse for on-site dining. This is actually already in place in several municipalities, also nationwide in Belgium, fun fact, and getting more and more momentum. And then we also see policies like reuse required for events or lodging or other kind of more specific venues. There's definitely been increased interest in requiring, for example, hotels and lodging establishments to do like bulk toiletries, dispensers, and things like that. And then we've got, the big one, which is reuse targets, mandatory targets, and funding for reuse systems in packaging policies like extended producer responsibility or deposit return systems or EPR, DRS. And we're starting to see that proliferate a lot in the US, but we have those already on the books in Maine, so I'm not going to get into them too much today. So speaking of what we've got on the books in Maine, we already have a bottle bill or a DRS, deposit return system, and now it includes funding for reuse and a feasibility study on reuse targets. This is great. And we have packaging EPR, as I just mentioned, and it also includes, now that the rules are adopted, reuse targets and financial incentives. Also great. We've updated our food code last year. It now clearly allows returnable, reusable packaging, that professionally cleaned third-party packaging, so that is excellent. And the town of York, I don't want to forget to mention them, has passed their single-use plastic foodware ordinance, which includes reuse for dine-in or on-site dining where dishwashing is available, and skip the stuff or that accessories on request policy at businesses and events. So we could see more municipalities passing those kinds of things at the local level, and we could also explore those at the state level. So that brings me to opportunities. We can still do more as a leader in the US and as a state. We could adopt a statewide procurement policy for reuse and repair and refurbished goods and donated goods, including schools in that. They're a huge opportunity to not only like educate our students and our next generation about reuse and repair and refurbishment and donation and all of those things, but also to really efficiently implement those programs on a pretty big scale if we got them in, say, an entire school district. We can also support the local economic development aspects of reuse systems. So this is really more just a reminder to make the connection that reuse creates jobs, a lot more jobs than recycling, in fact. So really, really good to leverage any economic development programs we have as a state for reuse purposes. And we can encourage and reward cities and towns for taking actions to support local reuse. We can establish and expand grants for community scale reuse programs. We can even explore things like a green bond program to invest in reuse systems. Green bonds are usually issued more commonly in Europe, but growing in popularity in the US, and they're usually issued for things like solar panel infrastructure and renewable energy, but there's no reason they can't also be issued for things like reuse infrastructure. There are even more opportunities, and I'll do this kind of quickly, but we are actually releasing as Upstream recommendations for reuse in state climate plans this summer. So I thought you all could get a sneak peek of some of those recommendations that we don't yet have implemented here in Maine. First, we could conduct a statewide like big scale public education and behavior change campaign promoting waste reduction and conscious consumerism. There are states that have done this with varying degrees of success. We can choose one carbon intensive waste stream or product and actually just go ahead and create a reuse or refurbishment or repair program for that category. And this is one of my favorite examples of a state really taking the lead here, is Maryland's Department of Aging. That's a state department in Maryland, has developed a really cool durable medical equipment reuse program. And if we have time, I have a 2-minute video about it that I can play at the end. It's really something. We can pass skip the stuff legislation. As I mentioned, this has already happened at the state level in California and Washington states, and over 80 municipalities in the US and Canada have passed this. We could do that in more towns and cities and or at the state level. We could also, importantly, provide tax breaks, subsidies, and or rebates to businesses and schools or school districts implementing reuse and repair programs or manufacturing reusables, especially in underserved areas. This is an important part of a just transition away from a disposable economy and toward a just reuse economy. If we're taking away jobs in waste management, we can be providing even more jobs in the development of reuse systems. We can also be the first state to pass reuse for on-site dining policy at the state level, and it would be important to include schools as a requirement there. But we can also see more towns and cities pass those policies first as well. And we could even further update our food code, even though we've already done this. There are still some things to be worked on. For example, we have an issue right now where you can only take a growler, like for beer or something, back to the same place you got it. There's no reason for that. We could definitely fix that and make growlers interchangeable. That's a tiny fix. We could also update our food code to allow BYO everywhere, and we could formally adopt the latest FDA food code, which is very friendly to reuse, which just got finalized in December. So I wanted to kind of end there and offer a few ways to contact Upstream if you're really jazzed about reuse and interested in these things. You can sign up for our Reuse Solutions Network. It's totally free. It's full of tons of people in the US and Canada that are just working toward reuse. It's all kinds of stakeholders. The only folks who are not eligible for that network are basically corporations and brands. But anyone else is free to join. And if you have any inquiries about state level policies, you can contact me directly, or you can contact my colleague Macy if you're interested in working on policy at the local level and you want some support for that. And then very last thing I'll mention is if you're really jazzed about reuse and you want to help reuse happen specifically in Maine, you're welcome to join our coalition, Reuse Maine, and we've got our info there as well. So I can stop there, and or if you want to see a cute 2-minute video about Maryland's program, I'm happy to play that, but your call.
Does anyone have any questions for Sydney? I think you still have a couple minutes as part of your time, Sydney, if you'd like to share that video.
All right, let's do it. Be warned, it's a little bit of a tearjerker, but like in a happy way. So I'm gonna go ahead and hit play.
My name is Patrick O'Malley. I had a spinal cord injury back in September of 2023. I was swimming in the ocean and got pummeled by a wave that drove me into the ocean floor and broke my neck. At University of Maryland Rehabilitation, it was a big dilemma of how I was going to leave the facility and get home. I needed to have the proper equipment for safety reasons. I was introduced to Maryland Reuse and Ian and his team.
Maryland Durable Medical Equipment Reuse is a service that provides mobility equipment to individuals in need. Individuals who are insured or who are uninsured often have difficulties in obtaining the equipment they need. Oftentimes there are supply chain delays, there are manufacturer shortages, individuals don't have the means to pay out of pocket. A side effect of this program is the environmental benefit. What we do is we collect equipment by donation. All equipment is sanitized, repaired, and then made available for reuse. We then provide that equipment to individuals with any illness, injury, or disability, regardless of their age, free of charge. The Department of Aging is really proud of this program because it allows us to provide healthy longevity. We assist individuals, we're able to help them live healthily, improve their quality of life, become more independent, discharged from a hospital or facility to live at home safely in a comfortable environment.
The care of my family at home, being able to sleep has really helped the healing process.
Thank you.
It's just amazing that people had this idea to help people in need.
It's our hope that this program can be replicated around the country or around the world. We've created the unofficial handbook for what we're hoping can be something that can be recreated elsewhere beyond Maryland.
All right, cool. I'll stop there. I just think that's such a good example of a state taking direct action to create a reuse program for its residents that we could certainly replicate here in Maine.
Great, thank you, Sydney. And just one more shot. Anyone have any questions for Sydney?
I do. I always wonder, so like of all these really good ideas and really nice things, what's the easiest, most fit, where can we, if we were going to try to like grab one is doable. Do you have any thoughts on what that is?
It's a good question because I gave a lot of options. I think there's kind of two buckets for that, right? There's like what's easiest in terms of passing a policy, and there are definitely policies that are easier and harder to pass, although we've already kind of passed the hard. We've already got the hard ones on the books, which is EPR and bottle bills, so we're in a pretty good way. But I would say in terms of passing a state level policy, you would think that a policy like skip the stuff might be easy to pass at a state level. I've actually heard that it's kind of difficult. It shouldn't be because it's good for everyone and it's really low-hanging fruit, but it is tough to enforce. You could imagine, right? How could we enforce against every restaurant in the state? So often the way that's handled is it'll be done at like the county or health inspector level, but it just becomes a little bit challenging. So that one is like usually one I throw out as an easy one, and now I'm sort of walking that back because I think it might be a little more challenging than originally thought. So I think something more like encouraging more local level policies in Maine on things like skip the stuff and reuse for on-site dining might be an easier next step, and anything the state can do to like help support that through our climate plan or otherwise would probably help, because once you have more momentum at the local level, that can kind of trickle upward to the state. So I would say for us, we don't have as many municipality level policies on the books, and that would be my next recommendation for Maine policy wise. But also, we can make some pretty easy updates to our food code, like those growlers, which is like small but just irksome. And then in the funding level, I think there are more like state programs that we could take on. And I would hope, but I truly don't know, that, giving some financial incentives to reuse providers to come to Maine, trying to like attract more reuse businesses and entrepreneurs to come to Maine to help support reuse in our updated bottle bill, our new EPR program, all the things. Like, I would hope that that would be a little bit on the easier side to do. Things like rebates or tax breaks or something for those businesses that are doing a lot of good would be great. And I also think working with our schools are tough. I acknowledge that, like, it's a big bureaucracy, but I would hope that if we had the weight of the state leaning in and helping us on schools, I think that could be a really viable next pathway, trying to get reuse for not just dining, but also like durable goods or donated goods or furniture sharing or that kind of thing. Anything that we can do in our schools, I think, would be a good first step.
I got another. That's okay. I agree with the schools. I would love to see stuff happening in schools. But when you're talking about the local ordinances, you made me think again of York. Like, is anyone tracking the results in York? Like, is it the cost that any of these restaurants might be having or saving, both on Skip the Stuff and the reusable on-site dining? So that, because I feel like if we had some good data like in Maine, that could help others pass those. But I know that all that data requires money and attention and time.
It's a great question, and I don't know is the short answer. We're not, as Upstream, like super intimately involved with implementing that policy. We track where policies have passed, and we've got a tracker for that, but I don't know if anyone's tracking on the ground. But I can try to find out for sure, and maybe that's something Reuse Maine can try to help with.
I've got a question. On Skip the Stuff, do you know where the opposition comes from mostly?
It is fascinating. So we've seen, like, for example, there's a bill in New Jersey right now this session to try to pass Skip the Stuff at the state level, and the opposition has in large part come from schools, and I think that demonstrates just a lack of understanding of the policy. But they would not be exempt in New Jersey, which is good. That's best practice. We don't want to exempt schools, but they just, I don't think there was enough groundwork maybe done to educate them and bring them into the coalition of supporters before the bill made it to session, is my guess. Again, we haven't been like directly involved in that bill, so I don't want to speak out of turn, but I hear that the schools are unfortunately a big opposition. And then sometimes you get the business associations, like the hospitality or restaurant associations, opposing, because I think it's just a lack of understanding that this actually saves them money and is easier for most businesses. Once it's passed, businesses who do comply usually love it because they're saving money. They don't have to stock up on like ketchup packets that no one wants. And overall, it works pretty well. I think that's most of the opposition I've heard from. So to me, the answer to that would be like greater coalition building and education before the policy makes it to like live legislative session.
All right. Thank you again, Sydney, for joining us today. Next, we're going to go to reducing and capturing methane emissions from the waste sector. And we're going to hear from Hillary Lister. And I will go ahead and let her introduce herself.
Thank you. Glad to be here. Really good presentation, the last one. So my name's Hillary Lister, and I was coordinator of the Reduce and Capture Methane Emissions subgroup of the Maine Materials Management task force, and I'm also first selectman in the town of Athens, where I oversee the transfer station. So also looking at this from that perspective. Just to dive into what the report recommends, unfortunately, our group had a number of recommendations, but due to the limitations of how much can be in the report, we got narrowed down to about 2. So here are the 2 primary recommendations that came out of the group. One was by 2030, develop and implement a strategic plan to reduce and capture methane by keeping food out of landfills and other actions identified by the Maine DEP's methane study. And in 2024, that study will estimate methane generation and identify cost-effective opportunities to reduce and capture methane from waste sources, including municipal solid waste, agricultural waste, and wastewater. And the study will inform the development of a plan to reduce and capture methane from these sources. Strategies could include avoiding landfilling high methane generating organic wastes, technical assistance to facilities, voluntary opportunities to reduce and capture methane through best practices like gas capture, biologically active landfill cover, and fire prevention. The second recommendation was to provide subsidies to make methane capture systems feasible for small landfills and incentivize anaerobic digestion and support diversion for food waste, manure, and other high methane producing materials from the waste stream. So getting into why is methane a problem in the first place? Methane's a very powerful greenhouse gas. It has a warming effect that's about 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide over a 20-year period. And new monitoring technologies suggest that landfills in the US are emitting significantly more methane than has previously been reported. Even with that, there have been reports in the past 10 years that methanes are one of the largest human-made sources of methane in this country and may be responsible for up to 1/3 of human-caused methane emissions. Landfill gas is created by decomposition of organic waste, so food waste is definitely a big piece of this under oxygen-deprived conditions in a landfill. And the landfill gas will initially consist of about 45 to 55% methane. Now, larger landfills are required to have gas capture systems. Those system efficiencies can vary significantly, with anywhere as low as 10% up to 65% of the target methane escaping into the atmosphere, and additional fugitive emissions arriving in cases where there's leaky pipes or damaged liners. And in Maine, this is no exception. This is a problem at Maine landfills, and maybe more so than some other states. In 2022, the state landfill in Old Town Juniper Ridge and the Waste Management's landfill in Norridge Walk Crossroads landfill, they were the 2nd and 5th largest industrial methane emitters in Maine, emitting a combined 270,000 tons of CO2. I did not get the amounts of methane, but Maine also hosts over a dozen non-reporting landfills. Many of these are smaller, closed ones that are still emitting methane. We just don't have the numbers on this. So why is this happening? Policies, unfortunately, have contributed to this problem, but hopefully with this report, there can be a shift in policies so there are no longer incentives or policies driving methane-producing wastes into landfills. So Maine was the first state in the Northeast to award Class 1 renewable energy credits to landfill gas to energy facilities. Now, these are facilities that are already required by the EPA to install gas collection and management systems. And overall, this seems like a good idea to incentivize them to capture the gas and use it to produce energy. Unfortunately, the way the incentives are structured, they can inadvertently create an incentive to generate more landfill gas than would necessarily naturally be generated in the landfill if there was not a financial incentive to produce larger amounts of this gas. And according to report, landfill gas to energy projects release more greenhouse gases than flaring in some cases. This report showed that gas to energy projects can generate potentially 3.8 to 7.8 times more greenhouse gas emissions than flaring alone. And this is based on both changes of management, ways of managing landfills that increase the generation of landfill gas. One of the major ways to produce more landfill gas is to have a wet landfill. Prior to this, so the industry standard was dry cell landfills. Unfortunately, dry cell is not producing significant amounts of gas. And unfortunately, as the states had to deal with PFAS contamination across the state on farmland and restricting PFAS containing materials from being land spread, that's resulted these materials ending up in the state's landfills. And these materials, they're sludge, they're wet wastes, and the addition of large volumes of wet wastes to landfills increases landfill gas generation, resulting in an increase of methane. The other thing contributing to this problem is if there's lack of adequate cover on the landfills, additional water can intrude into the landfill, also increasing methane levels. There are solutions to this. There's biologically active cover that contains methantropic microbes that consume methane. This is usually at the end of the life as a landfill, but installing this can reduce end of life methane generation by the landfill. Another big problem contributing is the increase in landfill fires across the board, with the increase in disposal of lithium-ion batteries, and also by increasing volumes of gas generating wastes in landfills. Landfill fires are becoming an increasing problem across the country. And methane is a highly flammable gas. It's explosive when present in concentrations as low as 5% by volume. And as it's formed, it builds up pressure and begins to move through the landfill and, if possible, through the soil, following the path of least resistance. Methane is lighter than air and it's flammable. Main landfills also are accepting large volumes of bulky waste and construction and demolition debris that, when mixed with these gas generating wastes, can create veins or pockets of air running through the landfill, and it can effectively create a chimney effect, drawing air through side slopes, increasing risk of fire and increasing, if fire does start, the difficulty in putting out that fire. Landfill fires can burn for months, and in the process, they destroy the gas management systems, piping, landfill covers, and landfill liners. So if there is a gas collection system in place, that system is effectively damaged and potentially made ineffective by landfill fires. So looking at solutions here, fortunately, in the past decade, a number of other states and Canadian provinces have taken action to reduce methane generation in landfills and also prevent landfill fires. Some of these actions have included restrictions on landfilling certain materials, such as construction and demolition debris, bulky waste, wet wastes, compostable materials, especially food. Also just management of landfills, requiring changes that require construction and demolition debris and bulky waste to be landfilled in separate cells or separate landfills from wet wastes. There's also requirements that landfills be fully compacted as much as possible throughout the lifetime of the landfill, limiting air pockets. Requirements to adequately monitor landfill gas systems after closure. Also look at firewalls in landfills for separating different types of wastes. Requirement for full daily cover on landfills to prevent water infiltration. This has been a concern, especially with the state landfill, of having large areas uncovered and resulting in water infiltration into the landfill. Requirements for biologically active landfill cover, and requirements for slope design designed to prevent destabilization from heavy rains. And also, one of the things is looking at how the incentives may promote certain management practices and potentially changing some of these incentives. So from the report, the task force report, it concluded incentives are needed to ensure that smaller landfills, which aren't currently required to install methane capture systems, can afford to install that equipment. Again, it's not required by the EPA, but it is a significant source of methane generation. And going forward, it's just going to be important that the subsidies aren't tied to the amount of methane generated and inadvertently creating an incentive for more methane gas generation. Also, it's important that subsidies for composting, anaerobic digestion, and alternatives to landfilling should be greater than any subsidies provided for landfill gas generation in order to drive materials with the lowest levels of greenhouse gas emissions to be processed and keep reusable materials, keep compostable materials out of landfills. And source separation of organic discards coupled with composting, biostabilization, and biologically active cover for landfills has been shown to be able to reduce methane emissions from landfills by as much as 95%. And again, looking at the incentives, it's going to be important to make sure that composting remains the first priority for managing food waste and agricultural waste, with the expansion of anaerobic digestion facilities. There's some push to send food waste there, and I understand in a situation where there is no composting facility available, that would be preferable to sending it to a landfill. However, it's important to note that once that food and agricultural materials are sent to an anaerobic digester, they're going to be mixed with a number of other materials that are not compostable and ultimately part of a mix of materials that are going to still end up in a landfill, just with less methane generation. So the other big piece of this is we really need to focus on supporting composting programs, keeping food and wet wastes out of landfills, and looking for management solutions that will prevent methane generation at landfills, especially preventing fires. So if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer. Otherwise, thank you for having me.
I just have a quick question. You mentioned that there are areas that have banned a lot of materials, bulky waste, construction debris, sludge from being deposited in their landfills. Do you know if they set up infrastructure and systems to manage those materials before they implemented their bans?
So my audio just cut out for most of your question. Could you repeat that question? I'm sorry.
Sure, no problem. My question is about the banned materials from landfills. The folks or the municipalities or states or whatever, the territories that banned materials from their landfill. Did they first establish infrastructure for managing those materials before they implemented their ban? And so
that's been one of the problems with that. To some degree, it's like in Massachusetts, New Jersey, the legislation that went with establishing those bans also included incentives and policies to establish the infrastructure to handle these materials. However, a lot of that has not materialized, and unfortunately, that means a lot of those materials are going to states like Maine, which have fewer restrictions on what can be landfilled. And right now, it is more affordable for some of these companies in other states to send the materials that are banned from their landfills up to Maine or to another state that does allow the landfilling. So it's really essential that there be infrastructure in place to handle this if any bans are going to be implemented, because otherwise it seems to just shift the burden onto whatever the closest state is that does not have that restriction.
Were there any other questions? All right, hearing none, I think we'll go ahead and move on. Thank you so much, Hillary, for joining us today and presenting that.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
We'll move on to the recommendation based on the discussion of reducing food loss and waste by 50% by 2030. And that will kind of be a tag team by Mark King and Suzanne Lee. So Mark King from the Maine DEP and Suzanne Lee from UMaine. So I'll turn the time over to them.
Thank you. Mark and I actually haven't really talked about. Mark, I don't know what part of this discussion you want to take.
It's all you.
All right, it's all Suzanne.
Okay.
Suzanne.
Okay, well, thank you. Suzanne Lee from the University of Maine, the Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions. Mark and I were both part of the Materials Management Task Force that this section of the reporting covers, and I wanted to, is it okay to share the screen? Is that working?
Yes, yep, I can see it.
Okay, so I think that since this is a continuing webinar talking about the climate action plan and how this all relates, I have slides on the whole thing, but I'll just click through a lot of it. The part that really we wanted to cover is the materials management and climate change and sort of the connection, particularly with regard to food waste. So everybody knows we have a climate action plan with these goals of reducing greenhouse gases, more resilient economy, foster economic opportunities, and advance equity. All of those relate to our work on the food, wasted food and food loss. So why did we have a materials management task force? I don't know if that's already been covered, but I thought, so I don't know, Jess, is this already, why was there this task force?
So Melanie and Cindy did kind of present on that last time, but I think we have a couple with us today who weren't here, if you want to touch on it really quickly.
Okay, because when the climate action plan was originally put together, waste streams, food waste in particular, weren't included as part of it because it was considered as waste, and as waste, the emissions are relatively low at 2%. And but in this go around, materials management versus waste management was the consideration. And materials management is more than just worrying about the end of the life of that resource stream. And it thinks about the consumption, use, as well as the end of life management. And when you look at streams like food, it takes up a much bigger, so it's now about 42% of our emissions. And so definitely it merited consideration. And that's why the materials management task force was put together to make recommendations for the climate action plan. Within the materials management task force, there were various materials streams looked at. Our team specifically was sort of a subset looking at food loss and waste. And why was that a particular issue? I mean, I think it's good going after Hillary because, in the landfills, I think 40% of the waste stream is actually the largest component is food, which is that wet material, which does lead to methane. I think this first point that EPA points out, food lost and waste alone wastes 140 million acres of agricultural land, 5.9 trillion gallons of blue water, the amount of pesticides, the fertilizers, and then releases 170 million, I'm not sure what that measurement is, but greenhouse gas impact is major. We also have the issue of in Maine that there is a tremendous amount of food insecurity. And so while we're wasting $218 billion worth of food, could be feeding people. The climate impact of US food waste equivalent to driving 50 million gas-powered vehicles. The first climate action plan really focused a lot on vehicles and on energy. And so that's why we're sort of looking this time that food waste is equivalent, has that much of an impact. If food waste for our country, it would be the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases after the US and China. So again, it's a more holistic view of materials, and food definitely isn't just wasting the food, but it's all the other parts of the waste. And even the part of food, it's the production of food that also emits greenhouse gases. So again, looking at the whole life cycle of food is really where we see the problem. In terms of the different pathways and what is important, the EPA, Maine has a food recovery hierarchy, and the EPA has its wasted food scale. They basically cover the same ground, but the EPA's version, kind of is more includes a lot of different areas, but it doesn't invalidate. And in many cases, Maine's food recovery hierarchy is a lot easier to understand, saying that reduction and recovery are really the best pathways. They prevent excess generation for maximum emissions and resource saving. Recycling has a much smaller emissions benefit because it does not do anything about all the impact of food production. And underneath recycling, we would consider composting as part of that. But the good part about composting is while it doesn't offset the food production problems, it does have environmental co-benefits like soil health, and that technology solutions, which are other ways of recycling, the issue to consider there is that they require a constant flow in this case, wasted food, which might conflict with actually the better goal of reducing waste. So those are just two considerations when you talk about recycling. One, in the case of composting, it has other benefits. And then, we actually refer to non-food disposal, all those pathways, landfill, down the drain or wastewater treatment, and incineration as what they are, which is really non-food disposal pathways. The damage and impact to the environment, producing significant methane. These are pathways that should not be used for food. Just to show you the impact from the different pathways, what we're talking about, reduction and recovery, you can see source reduction is the blue, food rescue and recovery is the red. Those have the greatest impact on methane production, and composting is in green, slightly ahead of anaerobic digestion. So just a graph to kind of give you a view of that. In our materials management task force, specifically the food group, these were the opportunities we saw, that currently just 4% of household waste was being composted in 2019, while 96% was going to these non-food disposal routes, landfill, incinerators, or down the drain. We, in 2024, and the Mitchell Center was involved working with the DEP on a food loss and waste study, which did find that data that 40% of our waste stream is food. And that 361,000 tons per year is the total food waste and loss that is generated by our state. Food manufacturers generating 40,000 tons of wasted food, more than half of which is good and edible. Farms produce about 90,000 tons of food surplus, which is not a problem in terms of landfilling or anything else, but just in a state where food insecurity is so high, this represents an opportunity to feed people. Grocery stores waste about 37,000 tons a year, even though they do they do some recycling and they do a lot of food donation, but still have a high degree of waste. And households send out about 120,000 tons of food annually to landfills and incinerators. But we are hearing a lot of calls from communities now who are concerned both economically and otherwise about that, about the cost and the dangers, environmental dangers and climate impact of all that food waste. So we are working on delivering, solutions for communities. The Materials Management Task Force, the specific recommendations that we made specifically to food loss and waste. Number 3, reduce food loss and waste by 50% by 2030. And so here's how we propose to do that. The first recommendation was legislating food waste generator annual reporting. So just like in our many studies that we do at the university, the first step to taking on the problem of food waste is to get good and accurate data so that we know what and where the food waste is coming from. In addition to that, what we think is exciting about this reporting is that it allows for publication of inventories of food byproduct streams that can actually be the catalyst for a lot of economic growth through upcycled food and, simple things like, I guess it's the idea one man's trash is another man's treasure, that, somebody's meat scraps could actually be used in the production of pet foods and things like that. So only by measuring and reporting what these food resources and where they are, can we actually, make use of them and come up with good solutions. So we have done studies like this with the Department of Corrections, tracking and measuring their wasted food and food loss, and come up with those real dollars and cents savings by coming up with solutions for that. We did a home tracker where we did also help households. Households waste about almost $2,000 a year in wasted food. But once we started helping people to track and measure that waste, this was only for a 4-week study. We were able to achieve, almost 20% reduction in the amount of wasted food. So tracking and measuring is a super effective first stop in terms of solutions. The second recommendation, which has also been proven as the most cost-effective solution for reducing food waste, is to do a food waste education campaign. Numerous case studies prove the importance. This is just such an essential thing. If you think about trying to stop any behavior that's a problem. You know, you can ban it, you can tell people, you know, you're not allowed to do it anymore. But, you know, if that's the communication and you don't educate them as to why that it's a problem and why they should care and what they could do differently, they will just resume that behavior, or there'll always be some tension because you have just forced them to stop. So educating, for example, in the UK, a Love Food Hate Waste campaign is actually one of the most successful efforts at reducing household food waste ever, you know, reduced it by 26%. And again, it was a campaign to educate the population in the UK about why food waste is a problem for the country and what people could do to change it. We've seen the same, you know, positive impact of our website that we created. We've also worked with communities to develop information kits, and we see these as all positive parts of changing that wasted food and food loss behavior. Right now I'm sitting with, you know, talking to you from a school because one of our most effective things in terms of education has been to work with elementary schools throughout the state and putting in place basic teaching them that food is energy and nutrients and it's never trash. We start by having them measure and sort out, like separate the food from the other trash. And in every school that we've worked with, this has been a continuing program that once the students understand the importance of food and not that it's not trash, it's a really, we believe, a lifelong behavior. And then the final recommendation was to maximize food rescue and recovery and donation of edible food. Like we said, we know that a majority of that wasted food and food loss in our state is really made up of good edible foods in excess. And we think that, you know, more should be done to direct that to feeding the people of our state who are in need. So that's the their part. And we have done some work, the Mitchell Center with our student interns have done work on food rescue and donation, you know, setting up community fridges, community suppers, you know, ways to take surplus food in a community and make it available to people in need has been, you know, shown to be a very worthwhile and, you know, perfect use of surplus food. So basically, how all those recommendations then fed into the climate action plan update of 2024 is what this slide is showing you. So in case you're wondering, okay, but what really happened? So we made those recommendations. And if you look at the climate action plan that was just released, strategy E, protecting the environment and natural and working lands and water, the strategy there was preventing food waste will reduce Maine's greenhouse gas emissions by decreasing the amount of food that decomposes in landfills. The tactic is to actually set the goal of reducing food loss and waste by 50% by 2030. And the, the specific areas that we, you know, the actions were tracking and measuring to reduce food loss and waste, increasing consumer education regarding the issue of food loss and waste and what people can do about it, making sure that we're distributing all excess food to feeding the people in our state who need it. And for any excess food that cannot be eaten, so that inedible portion, that we build what Hillary was talking about, those valuable compost and anaerobic digestion pathways, you know, so that we don't just say it's not, we should not do this anymore, but we actually make sure that we're building the infrastructure that will get the valuable food resources to where they are needed instead of where they don't belong. And then even beyond the impact of the climate action plan, or I guess maybe I should say as of continuing the work, there's actually was legislation drafted for this 132nd session of the Maine legislature to deliver on that goal of reducing wasted food and food loss by 50%. The legislation strategy tried to use this wealth of Maine food materials management research and learning that had come through the climate action plan, that had come through the Maine food waste generation study, and that had come through a number of pilots and a number of activities that businesses and communities throughout our state have been doing, sort of best practices. So we want to use all that. We wanted to importantly reestablish the value of food as a key resource in our state to feed people, to feed our animals, and to feed our soil. And the notion of food as as trash, and literally the wording of it as food waste should no longer be used. I mean, food is not waste. Food is not trash. The other strategy was to give a 5-year rollout to build the proper foundation for long-term success. So exactly what Hillary mentioned is, to give the time for the infrastructure to develop and then ultimately close the non-food disposal resources to commercial food disposal. So if you look at the legislation as it was drafted, it first created that main food resource annual reporting and resource directory publication. That was in the beginning years, providing statewide food resource education, main food too good to waste, look to expand statewide food donation and recovery programs, look to establish a healthy soils compost market research and development effort, build this food resource management infrastructure. And then finally, at the end of the 5 years, close non-food disposal resources, that landfill, incineration, and down the drain to all commercial food disposal. So anyway, so that is the story and sort of the pathway for our food waste work in the state as it relates to the climate action plan and then beyond to the legislation. I think that's it. I hope I didn't use too much time.
That was perfect. Thank you, Suzanne. Does anyone have any questions for Suzanne?
Yeah. Can you go back to slide 9? I think that's what it was.
Yes, I should give credit to Megan Pryor. We did a presentation together, and so some of these slides are actually I borrowed from her. So I can speak to them, but just, there was a lot of good data here that she put together.
Okay, someplace in that slide.
Yep.
I'm curious about the amount of food waste. You just told me not to use that term, but
yes, wasted food, wasted food and food loss. Yep.
There's a total tonnage.
Yep.
And then there's the amount of that food that can be used. And I think someplace on that slide, it talks about that.
Yeah.
So my question comes down to the bullets that say food manufacturers generate 40,000 tons of wasted food.
Mm-hmm.
And others, it gives a tonnage there, but only a portion of that is really reusable. Is that?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so these tonnages,
The total,
like grocery stores waste 37,000.
Yes. I think all of this
a
data,
portion of that 37,000 can't be eaten.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, this is all based on the 2024 Maine Food Loss and Waste Generation Study. That study quantified the food waste generation or wasted food and food loss generation across the 15 key sectors that do generate that wasted food and food loss. And it gave it also by county in the state. So it gave us the data on what those totals are. And so that's the 361,000 tons per year across all those 15 sectors across our whole state. And then those other bullet points just sort of key on some of those 15 sectors to talk about how much. And what we know, I guess really what we should say is in total of the 361,000 tons that we know that more than half of it would still be good and edible. So could be making its way to feed people. Is that what you were?
Yeah, yeah.
So that's why this work and this legislation, while it came out of the climate action plan, I also was working on the ending hunger by 2030 with that group. And this work on reducing wasted food and food loss in the state was exactly a bullet point in terms of their strategy also. It doesn't solve it doesn't solve the ending hunger problem, but definitely, and we just were talking with Good Shepherd Food Bank yesterday about this, that their programs that they are developing to try to feed the need, address the need in our state for food are the same types of programs that we love for getting food out of the non-food disposal resources, landfill, incineration, and down the drain, and into feeding people. So you kind of get 2 for 1 by working on food waste. Does that make sense?
It's not really a question. I think it's more of a comment observation with Sydney's presentation, refill and reusables, and with yours, Suzanne, seems like there's a big call to education and getting that, getting the public educated. I don't know how we're going to do that.
Well, the specific, in the legislation where we talk about, it was actually, in the first year wanting to do that. One of the things that we thought would really be important is, and because we've done enough of the pilots and testing of this to know that it can be effective. So if you're having these large food waste generators reporting, and it's 2 ton, and then it's 1 ton, and then it's half ton. I mean, that covers a lot of commercial entities who employ a lot of people. So along with that reporting, part of what they would get would be an education package to actually educate those organizations about this food waste. So that's one way to deliver the education. They're reporting not because somebody wants to make them report, because somebody thinks it should be good to have more, paperwork to do. There's really a reason. And so as part of that reporting strategy, really needs to be education. And when you're talking to big organizations, those are people who live in our community. So you're kind of getting, a double hit with that. We also have had great success, like I said, with the elementary school programs, a 15-minute assembly, school-wide assembly for K through 6th graders. And by the next week, the kids are really understanding that food doesn't belong in the trash anymore. And, we've been doing follow-up. This is probably our 3rd year of being out with the schools. These lessons do continue. They take it to middle school and high school. So we called out in the legislation that, working through schools, and then our libraries, our public libraries, are a tremendous statewide resource. Almost every community in the state has a library, and they do provide a lot of community service already. We have in some cases, food scraps drop-off bins located near the public library. And so, they could also be, and they have proven themselves to be great partners in getting the word out. So we think and we think that very similar to Love Food, Hate Waste, this Maine Food Too Good to Waste is really a very unifying call to action. So that was kind of what we were thinking about based on the work that we've done.
It looks like Sydney has a question.
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to add to that. I think Suzanne is obviously spot on with all of those recommendations about education. And I just wanted to acknowledge, I mentioned that too, but I think not only are all of those recommendations things we should continue doing and do more of, when it comes to packaging, like education about reusable packaging as well, there are synergies because reusable packaging reduces food waste. It's more durable and substantive, and there's evidence to show that it helps food last longer. So there's some synergies there that we could do a combined educational effort there, but also you have requirements in the EPR law, the packaging EPR law, for the stewardship organization to do statewide education. So, we also have the big brands where the money lies responsible for doing some glossier, high level public outreach and education campaigns. And we just did a live stream this morning where we brought in the packaging PRO from France, and they talked all about their extensive education efforts that are nationwide over there. So I think there are even additional opportunities to get sort of industry on board as well. And not only actively do some of that education, but pay for it.
Yeah, that's a great, yes. Terrific idea and super effective. Yeah, I mean, the synergies, I mean, we always, at the Mitchell Center, that's the belief in collaboration, what we don't have to each spend our own dollar, like, figure out how to work together, and then even better, figure out how to have somebody else's dollar to help support these good efforts. So that's a great point. Thanks, Sydney.
Well, thank you, Suzanne, for hopping on and joining us today. We will move to our concluding presenter, who is actually going to cover a couple different topics about the fostering resilience in the built environment through materials collection and reuse, and then regionalize and scale up access to waste prevention and diversion services. And we're going to hear from Alex DeParo, who's with the Lincoln County Regional Planning Commission.
Great, thank you so much, and great job on all the other presentations. It's nice to be back with my colleagues from the Materials Management Task Force. I'm Alex DeParo from the Lincoln County Regional Planning Commission. I'm the lead economic development person for the commission and for the county. And I'll give the caveat that materials management is really not the primary focus of my work. But I did spend a ton of time in Vermont doing that work. Again, not as my primary focus, and both at the state level and in the city of Burlington, and ended up on the Materials Management Task Force here in Maine, and also am the co-chair or the chair of the city's Solid Waste Advisory Board in Bath, Maine, where I live. So without further ado, I'm gonna share my screen and talk a little bit about the two areas that I was supposed to focus on today, which are fostering resilience in the built environment through materials collection and reuse, and regionalizing and scaling up access to waste prevention and diversion service. And although I'm presenting on these strategies, they're not a reflection of my own personal or Lincoln County's priorities. They're the result of a multi-stakeholder consensus through a robust 6-month task force process that Suzanne did a really great job of explaining, as did our other partners in the previous webinar. Additionally, much of the language I'm sharing here today is borrowed with permission from documents created by the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future, and largely created by Megan Mansfield Pryor, without whom this work would have not been possible. So the first strategy I'm going to focus on is fostering resilience in the built environment through materials collection and reuse. Why did we choose this strategy as one of our priorities? Well, because of the recognition that construction materials present a huge part of the waste stream, and there's much opportunity to better utilize those materials. And as the cost of materials go up and our state has a need for more than 80,000 new housing units, there's also an opportunity to increase affordability through these efforts. And then the other piece of that we did look at was related to storm debris, and so we chose the action related to that due to the aftermath of last winter's devastating storms, and there was a recognition that storm debris management efforts could be greatly improved. So we really focused on 3 actions here. I'll go over them really quickly, and then I'll get a little bit more in depth. So number 1, ensure that municipalities require permits for demolitions taking place within their borders and post a minimum of 2 weeks public notice pending demolitions. The second action would be to require construction in state funded construction projects that meet certain thresholds to be designed for deconstruction and reuse by 2030. And to be sourced from materials with lower global warming potential and based on environmental product declarations. And 3, increase capacity for collaborative infrastructure to manage storm debris through ensuring hazardous and household waste streams are properly managed. So going back to the first action here, demolition is the typical method for disposing of buildings that are either in the way of a new project or structure or have reached their end of life, resulting in significant loss of potential useful and valuable material. In a state with a housing stock that is as old as ours and in as much disrepair, this is a regular practice. In terms of embodied carbon, this is most impactful for buildings constructed of high carbon materials such as concrete, but also result in a loss of high value materials that cannot be replaced when older homes are demolished, such as heritage timber from old growth lumber. That second action, so just real quick, I mentioned environmental production declarations or EPDs. Those are to translate complex life cycle analyses language for easy, understandable labels for consumers, or in this case, usually builders. Researchers have identified the fact that existing commercial buildings aren't designed for easy deconstruction as a key barrier to circular systems for building material. As noted in a 2022 Resourceful Maine policy briefing from the University of Maine on exploring multiple forms of value in Maine's reuse sector, quote, one study, for example, estimated that up to 95% of building materials landfilled each year could be reused. The authors estimate that if buildings were designed with reuse rather than recycle in mind, 88% of the global warming potential for these materials could be avoided, end quote. Buildings are a key target for reducing emissions. From a COP28 press release announcing a new partnership and initiatives to advance sustainable urban development, quote, the building sector alone accounts for nearly 40% of global energy-related CO2 emissions, 50% of extracted materials, and 1/3 of global waste. That's pretty compelling. And then the third action, which is related to storm debris and infrastructure to manage storm debris through ensuring hazardous waste streams are properly managed. There are sort of two pieces to this. So we believe that volunteer networks can be leveraged during and after storm events for immediate cleanup, but comprehensive planning around storm debris would reduce further risk, including environmental contamination from stored wastes, and ensure adequate capacity to safely manage storm debris in future disasters. As extended producer responsibility program for hazardous household waste would help communities build resilience by decreasing risk of environmental contamination from flooded basements and garages and ensuring affordable, accessible, and regular household waste collection. So that's the hazardous waste collection piece, both the planning side of it and also the management. And the second sort of part of this was related to the subgroup reviewing resilience for improving storm debris management, of which I was an active participant. And we recommended a suite of potential actions for comprehensive approach, which included incentivize towns to submit registration for temporary debris management site, create a user-friendly state storm debris management plan, include summary and additional communication materials on storm debris recovery, which can be considered by the new Commission on Infrastructure Rebuilding and Resilience, and can be based on MEMA debris management plan. Also, building capacity among councils of governments and regional planning orgs to provide robust technical assistance and education about storm preparedness and debris management in close collaboration with state and federal agencies like FEMA, DEP, DMR, EPA, FEMA, Maine Municipal Association, county EMAs, etc. and incentivize municipalities to implement a storm warning system to notify coastal residents and property owners to prepare to reduce the potential for storm debris, incentivize municipalities to help residents separate storm debris, and enhance coordination with private businesses like scrap metal dealers to reduce emissions through recycling and reduce transportation. And lastly, create a volunteer network through existing entities like Vermont Volunteer Maine to deploy post-storm assistance in debris management. So as you can see, a lot of what we focused on was better coordination and leveraging what is already existing in municipal, regional, and state entities. And I'll just say that DEP was a huge partner in our materials management task force, and were an invaluable resource, and often pointed out to existing programs that are really excellent that could be leveraged even further than we already do. The second strategy that I'm focusing on today is regionalize and scale up access to waste prevention and diversion services. So why did we choose this strategy? So statewide, there is a recognition that the very important value of local control in Maine has led to some unfortunate consequences in the form of inefficiency and lack of coordination. Lack of coordination is something that came up a lot in our conversations in the materials management task force, which is why it became a focus as a strategy. This strategy is particularly close to my heart as a member of a regional planning organization. Our organization, the Lincoln County Regional Planning Commission, in particular is unique because we are within county government. We are the only planning organization within county government. And our county government also houses a robust recycling program. So I hope that we can in the future lead by example and model some of the efforts I will discuss today. So again, I'll quickly go over our actions. We suggest create funding for additional staff capacity for technical assistance and materials management planning support. Provide state-level coordination, technical assistance, and planning support to regional, like Lincoln County Regional Planning Commission, and local entities like towns to encourage regionalization and provide municipalities with decision-making tools on climate implications of materials management. And finally, develop model municipal ordinances and have best practice guides to ensure equitable access to waste prevention and diversion programs. So going back to that first action, creating funding for additional staff capacity and technical assistance and materials management planning support. This recommendation strongly links with resilience for dealing with storm debris and has equity implications. Planning and technical support to disadvantaged communities would include making concrete examples of accessible program options available that will reduce emissions and waste. For example, sharing electric tools reduces direct emissions as well as consumption-based emissions by allowing people to share tools rather than each household purchasing their own, in addition to making costly climate-friendly tools widely available regardless of income and ability to purchase. Some towns in Maine are doing this or piloting it. I know that the city of Bath is looking at doing this through the library. South Portland is an example of an electric lawn tool lending program. Also assemble a network of partnerships with existing programs and entities to support diversion through volunteer and/or intern work in accordance with existing state regulations, and establish revolving funds for community sustainable projects overseen by municipal or regional entities, such as regional councils like Lincoln County Planning Commission, Through the development of local comprehensive plans, municipalities should consider opportunities to expand and improve materials management practices, particularly for prevention, diversion, and safe management of household hazardous waste, universal waste, food scraps, recyclables, and demolition debris. And consider waste surcharges to fund diversion, although best not to use this for household waste if a smart plan using technology is implemented, although surcharges could apply to specific non-residential waste streams to encourage reduction. The second action, provide state level coordination, technical assistance and planning support to regional organizations like us and local entities to encourage regionalization and provide municipalities with decision-making tools. So the stewardship organization, which was mentioned earlier, is tasked with Maine's EPR for packaging program, maybe a natural vehicle for state level coordination of materials management programs, particularly for convening municipalities and helping to identify opportunities for regionalization and economies of scale with diversion programs. A lot of towns do not coordinate waste services and therefore end up paying a lot more than they would if they coordinated better at a regional level. This action includes a goal to ensure that municipalities developing climate plans are provided resources that they can use to assess the emissions impact of their materials management processes and programs. Municipalities may also benefit from support in understanding the viability, cost, and climate, health, and environmental impacts of various technologies for materials management. I suggest you look at the City of Portland Climate Action Trust Fund for an example of something that looks like that. Policies also policies to ensure sustainable community planning for materials management should be wrapped into state level guidance as well. And again, like I mentioned earlier, DEP is an invaluable resource. So a lot of programming does exist at the state level, and this is really just trying to leverage coordination to make a better impact at the end. And then finally, for our third action, develop model municipal ordinances and best practice guides to ensure equitable access to waste prevention and diversion programs and services. So equitable access to diversion will also increase the material diverted from disposal, thereby reducing emissions from landfill disposal and preserving resources in recyclables and food scraps for higher or better use. A 2023 report from the Alliance of Mission-Based Recyclers noted that, quote, recycling across the U.S. is generally more convenient in more affluent communities and among single-family homes. Apartment residents often lack on-site recycling services, creating a service inequity between single-family homes and multi-family homes. Only 4% of multifamily properties have recycling on-site, compared with 52% of single-family homes with curbside recycling. In addition, many communities cannot afford to provide recycling drop-off centers, and rural areas face significantly higher costs in doing so. The report also noted that EPR can create sustainable funding systems to support convenient, equitable recycling for all residents, regardless of income, housing type, or demographics. A common goal of EPR is for all residents to have recycling that is as convenient as their trash. Maine's EPR for packaging program can take learnings from EcoMaine's EPA grant-funded program to scale up services and ensure equitable access to understand populations and communities. While that program has a particular focus on multifamily dwelling units, apartments, condos, multiplexes, and fourplexes, rural areas should also be considered from a statewide perspective, creating statewide translated and or image-based outreach materials will ensure language and cultural differences are not a barrier in clear communications. So that concludes my discussion of these two strategies and the associated action with each. And I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention that there's a couple of upcoming webinars that might interest you. They're both including Megan Mansfield Pryor, who was the Governor's Office of Policy, Innovation, and the Future staff person who led our materials management task force. The first one is about deconstruction, and so the benefits and challenges of brownfields and other waste site cleanup sites. So that's with Dan Costello as well. So Megan Mansfield Pryor and Dan Costello. That is being hosted by the Northeast Waste Management Officials Association. That'll be on March 11th. And the other upcoming workshop is with Megan and Danny Solomon, and that is an introduction of deconstruction, and that is hosted by Passive House Maine, and that's on March 12th, the next day. So Megan will be pretty busy for both of those days. So at that, I'm going to stop sharing and see if we have any questions. Did everybody get the message that better coordination is really important, and collaboration among local, regional, state partners?
Yeah, we got a thumbs up.
Hillary, another great member of our task force.
All righty. Well, if there are no other questions, I want to thank you all for joining us, our presenters and our attendees. And I hope you have a great day, and we'll see you next time around. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.